Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Ian Cooper and I'm the course leader for the Biological Sciences degrees here at Brighton. I'm going to give you an overview of bubonic plague as an introduction to the sort of disease that we might look at within one of the topics on infectious disease here within the Biological Sciences degrees, Ecology and Conservation, or perhaps Biomedical Science. We tend to think of bubonic plague as a disease that certainly affected the UK a very long time ago, but the disease still does occur in different areas around the world, and it's quite an unusual disease because it involves several different organisms. We're perhaps familiar with the idea of rats and fleas, but the actual organism that causes the disease is a bacterial cell, a bacterial species. So let's have a look in some detail. Just a quick note, this is a very brief overview of the topic. We would go into much more detail if we were going to study this within one of the modules on either the biological sciences, ecology and conservation, or the biomedical science degree. This is an interesting degree because it's often misdiagnosed. One of the reasons being that it is very, very rare, certainly in some parts of the world, and incredibly rare, meaning that clinicians can often miss the symptoms or not join the dots, as it were, between what the different symptoms linking mean to provide an overview of the disease and then perhaps a diagnosis leading towards effective treatment. So what is plague? Plague is a bacterial disease and it is associated with one of the pandemics that has really affected and perhaps even shaped human society over the years. At the time of this recording, we will all be familiar with the coronavirus pandemic and perhaps the influenza pandemic of the 20th century. This is different because it's spread by a bacterial species, as we're about to see. It's also what we would refer to as a notifiable disease, meaning that if you see signs of the infectious disease in humans, you need to report it to the authorities immediately. So, it's a bacterial disease, but it's spread by the bite of fleas. This is where, as you can see in the image here, this particular flea would acquire the bacterial species when it takes a blood meal from a host animal, in this case, the rat. Then the flea might jump to a human and transmit that bacterium through the next bite. When the disease moves from animal, in this case the flea, to the human, it is termed a zoonotic disease. Here on the top right, you can see an image of the bacterial cells. These have been stained using a type of stain called a Gram stain. And this is the microscope image of the individual bacterial cells. This is Yersinia pestis. The rats become infected when the fleas bite the rats and transfer the bacterium into their blood system. Then the rats will transmit it to another flea when that flea takes a blood meal. So the rats in this case are acting as the reservoir for the infectious organism, but it's the bite of the flea that really matters. There are actually three types of plague. We're probably more familiar with the first one, bubonic plague, which is the swelling of the lymph nodes, as we'll see a little bit later on. I'm going to focus on that one a bit later because, as I say, it's the one that I think we're all familiar with. But there are actually two other types of plague as well. Septicemic plague, which is exposure through the skin, perhaps a cut or something, or inhalation of the bacteria. So perhaps you're familiar with the idea of forced coughing leading to blood being present in the sputum. If a person was unfortunate enough to breathe in an aerosol, one of those tiny little mucus and water droplets containing the bacteria, that could lead to spread of the disease as well. In the Middle Ages, the disease was spread throughout Europe quite rapidly. There is a lot of evidence suggesting that the plague was spread from a ship which landed in Italy and then spread very rapidly through the continent. And on the top right of this particular image, you can see the different timescales relating to the different coloured portions of the map with current borders and boundaries noted on there. This is an interesting map because what it shows is the disease would have spread rather rapidly within these regions. And It's believed that somewhere up to about 50, estimates put it at between 25 and 50% of Europe's population would have fallen victim to this particular plague. And that's really crucial. Why did it have such an effect? Well, at this time, people didn't understand the idea of disease transmission as we might do and hygiene. You might be familiar with the term miasma and everything relating to bad smells, but not necessarily disease spread through contact with, let's say in this case, with a rat or even with a dead body. A lot wasn't known at this time. And if you think of environmental conditions and what happened to fecal matter and waste in general, a lot of it would have been left to build up, and that would have attracted rats. So there is a real link between living conditions and environmental conditions, if you will, and the spread of this disease. The bacterium is actually a member of the Enterobacteriaceae family, which is a family, as the name suggests, of enteric or gut bacteria, and well, mainly associated with the gut. And it is actually relatively closely related to some species that you probably heard of, like Salmonella and E. coli. This particular bacterium is actually sensitive to certain environmental conditions, which I'm sure some of you think might be a little unusual, but it's correct. Therefore, by mapping the environmental conditions, we might be able to determine disease prevalence for this particular infectious disease, linking, of course, to where the flea and the rat are able to survive. So the environment is really important to map here as well. This is an engraving from the bubonic plague all those years ago. And as you can see, these people have all these buboes developing on their body. These are large lymph nodes. If any of you have ever had something like perhaps a throat infection, perhaps tonsillitis, or perhaps an ear infection or anything like that, and you felt underneath the chin and down the neck and you felt little lumps come up, those little lymph nodes, that's exactly what these are, those lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are part of the immune system, so this is the body taking in the bacterium and trying to develop a defense against it. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily work. At the time, many people believed that the Black Death, as it was called, was a punishment for the way people were living. And as you can see in the image on the right, this shows a lot of people walking away from infected and perhaps even dead bodies. This brings us back to the idea of environmental health, and perhaps we need to dispose of wastes appropriately. The image on the left shows the outfit of a plague doctor. Now, this must have been absolutely terrifying to see this person come along into your home. If you look at what he's wearing, he's got a long staff to poke people, rather than physically touch them, to see if they are still alive. He's wearing a long, thick leather apron and coat, leather gloves and shoes, and a leather hat. Again, prevention of contact. But you'll notice the mask, particularly the beak, I'm sure stands out to you. The beak actually had two nostril holes at the end of it, and inside the beak were packed aromatic plants and flowers. The idea at the time being that the good smells, the nice smells from the plants, would prevent the inhalation of any bad smells, any miasma. Remember, they didn't know about the bacteria, but they did believe it was through bad smell. So that was the logic of the beak compartment. Here is a map showing the incidence of plague from 2013 to 2018. And this is the latest data set that we have. As you can see, the size of the spot indicates the number of plague cases reported, and the key's in the bottom left so you can work out those numbers. As you can see, plague is prevalent all over the world. And this is really important to understand, because when I was talking a little while ago about environmental conditions, about semi-arid regions perhaps, where the bacterium can survive, or if you look at it the other way, where it might not survive, let's see what we can work out for the United States. Here's a map of plague cases in the USA between 1970 and 2018. And as you can see, most of them are clustered around regions that are semi-arid, not necessarily desert or wet areas. So this again links back to that idea that we might be able to map the incidence of infectious disease against environmental conditions where the host animals might survive, but also where the bacteria might be able to survive. Here you can see quite a large swelling under this person's arm. And this would be one of those lymph nodes that we talked about. And this is where after the flea has bitten the human, the bacteria will be transported in the blood to one of these lymph nodes, and then it starts to swell with fluid and white blood cells, which are actively trying to destroy, to inactivate that incoming bacterium. In terms of disease outcome, you can see from this slide that really failure to seek medical advice or the correct diagnosis is a key issue here, because as you can see from the numbers in the top part of the slide, it's actually quite a rare disease, and a lot of people miss the symptoms because it is so rare. It's that simple. You can see from the middle part that actually mortality can be very high percentage-wise for this disease, and that perhaps means that we need a greater education program to tell people what the signs and symptoms are, perhaps linking to lifestyle or even a job, their occupation. Do they come into contact with areas that might contain large numbers of rats, for example? There is actually a vaccine available, but it's not really commonly used because the disease is so rare nowadays. And also, it's not effective against the pneumonic version of the plague, and that's the one, if you remember, that affects the lungs. So what can we do about it? Well, flea control is absolutely pivotal, but realistically, is prevention with the rats, with wildlife, is complete exclusion of the rats from our homes, from our lifestyle, shall we say? Is that feasible? I'll leave you to think about that point. Realistically, if a person or an animal does present as infected, then we need to get that diagnosis as quickly as possible in order to prescribe some sort of treatment, usually an antibiotic treatment. That brings me to the end of what I wanted to say. I hope it's been interesting for you. So just to summarize a couple of points. Even though we tend to think of bubonic plague as something that happened a very long time ago, realistically, the disease has never gone away. It still does occur in incidents around the world. Realistically, we don't just need to look at the human population, we need to look at the animals and the environment as well. If we can get a diagnosis quickly, we stand a much better chance of being able to treat that person or that animal. Thank you very much for your time.